Sorry about that. I knocked over my camera, so hopefully at home it didn't cause you to fall off your chair or spill your coffee. That was an abrupt, radical lane change, like I'm driving.
I'm going to use this at this point.
Verses 11 and 12, yeah. Who are the heirs?
Who are the heirs?
The heirs of the kingdom.
Who are the heirs? And who are these outsiders?
Yeah. So Jew and Gentile, trying to keep it as easy as possible here. All the Jews are the insiders and the heirs of the kingdom. Men and women, all Jews, through Old Testament time to the time of Jesus. And as Matthew's writing this gospel, we're going to get to this in a little bit, Matthew has a Jewish audience mixed with a lot of Greeks or Gentiles, outsiders. So anybody who was not Jew, the term was Gentile, or it literally meant like outsider, excluded, not good enough. All those connotations are there. I'm being friendly. They used a lot dirtier language, as you can understand. People who see each other in categories. You ever heard of this? In America, there was a time when we thought north and south, right? And the northern states fought the southern states, and those of us from Virginia, we call it the War of Northern Aggression. And those, anyway, I'm teasing a little bit, but you've probably heard how people divide, and when they feel divided, they call the other names. So Gentiles was kind of like that, by the way. So they were, to say outsiders, and Jesus lifting up an outsider like this Roman Gentile centurion, that would have been like fighting words. Verse 12, the heirs of the kingdom would have been Jesus, his disciples, Mary, any natural-born Jew. And what Jesus is talking about is there are many of his own family, his own religion, his own Jewish ethnicity who are not believing Jesus, and they're going to find themselves on the outside, or in this, stark language, thrown to the outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that language is repeated again and again. It's probably just one of the most stark phrases. It's an expression of how once you're stuck on the outside, you're going to regret. You're going to feel all those negative feelings of rejection and despair and so on and so forth. Ominous noises. The screen is coming down magically. We don't know how. Behind me, you can see it in the video. It's coming down right behind my head. We don't know why these things happen. Eleanor, more clarification. Go ahead.
I guess I'm really confused because it says at 11, I tell you, many will come from east and west and will take their places at the banquet with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven.
Right. Yes. You're fine. So this is a great question. Again, Matthew 8, verses 11 and 12. Jesus is pointing to, and this had become through the Old Testament, a growing understanding of heaven beyond the grave. So I'm going to do this really quickly. I'm looking at the time. Early in the Old Testament, there is no indication in ancient Hebrew faith that there was a sense of an afterlife. But somewhere between the prophets that were written, say, 400 or 500 years, then Jesus comes on the stage. This idea of the kingdom of heaven and an afterlife has grown into more popular acceptance, right? So Jesus is pointing to an ultimate justice of God where there will be reward for those who have faith, the heavenly kingdom or heavenly banquet. Certainly the heroes of the Old Testament, these are named as the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their spouses are not named, but their family are certainly understood and included. And that the heirs of the kingdom, so to speak, are any Israelite, any Jewish person. Any Jewish person would be part of that kingdom. And it doesn't matter how you live your life necessarily morally, individually. But whether you accept or reject Jesus then becomes the criteria in this passage and in others for whether or not you're actually going to be seated around that table. So I'm going back to the beginning of this class, Matthew's understanding or our understanding of Jesus. It's presented in this way that Jesus challenges the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is all you got to do is be born. Human family is your ticket to heavenly acceptance, right? That's the Jewish religion or the humanistic understanding. Jesus kind of turns that on its ear and is saying, having a heart that has faith in God and sees God in the person of Jesus as the Son of God, the power to do all these things is to help people have faith in God, right? And so that's the criteria now, not who your daddy was. Hopefully that helps. But in essence of time, let me move on. He touches his mother-in-law, Peter's mother-in-law, and heals her fever. So I'm through verse 17 now. It's a fulfillment. Matthew's so quick to add a prophecy fulfilled here. So this is from Isaiah, the suffering servant songs. He took on our infirmities and bore our diseases. Now, we may think she had a fever. Fevers people recover from. But in the ancient time, fever was something only God could heal. So again, Jesus' touch with compassion and his healing of somebody instantaneously like this, raising her up, is an indication that Jesus has power from God or is God here on earth. And what I would say is one story after another in this chapter prove that Jesus can do all of these things that people would expect only God could do, and that no sin is too great, no disease is too severe for Jesus, right? He can help and heal and forgive all of it. That's good news. Verse 18, he saw the crowds around him. He gave orders to go to the other side. What is the other side? Are we talking about life and death here? Well, maybe more metaphorically, but seriously, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. You all understand where I serve as pastor. I'm under contract to repeat the name Galilee as many times in these videos. I'm not. That's not true. Some people suspect I'm being paid by the word. That's also not true. All right, I move on. A scribe approached. Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Interesting. So a little interruption here. Verse 20. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another disciple said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. And Jesus said, follow me, let the dead bury their own dead. At this moment, let me make a gesture. I mean, he's been very compassionate, Jesus, in this chapter, in these other interpersonal interactions. Where's he come off with this sort of, it looks like a, social faux pas. It looks like an insult. Is he all of a sudden no longer compassionate? It seems insensitive, Jesus. I mean, as a pastor, let me tell you, I wouldn't last long if anyway. It's conventional wisdom contrasted with hyperbole. Sometimes Jesus uses very extreme language, hyperbolic, over-the-top language, hyperbole. Now, certainly, Jesus is not insisting that we all be lawbreakers, because there's the fourth commandment, honor your mother and father. There's this, ritual duty. There's tradition. There's the love of family, which is a very high priority in that community. It's not because Jesus suddenly is a lawbreaker or has no compassion. Jesus steps into the role of the prophet here that says only God can, on occasion, and there are scriptural examples of this, put the priority of importance on a family aside for a minute for the urgency of the message of God. It's for the urgency of demonstrating God's power and presence in Jesus, of getting the message of good news and repentance out there. In other words, Jesus may have said with a little bit more, better approach, a little softer, he may have said words like this. Your competing commitments are holding you back. I mean, think about that for us when we hear phrases like, seek first the kingdom of God. We're like, yeah, we did church on Sunday morning, so now we can do whatever we want. No, there has to be this urgent sense of being loyal to what God needs us to do immediately. Another way is discipleship is not a road to success or personal security, but rather it's a challenge followed by another challenge, followed by another. So the man or the men who come to him in this section have really too many loyalties, competing loyalties, or too many commitments for them to follow Jesus in the urgent way that he is insisting. So I kind of leave that with you. It doesn't really solve the riddle, but maybe it helps us to understand Jesus pointing to the costly call of discipleship. Now, when he got into the boat, verse 23, let me remind you, all these fishermen, they were sailors. Sailors. Think about that ancient act of faith. Sailing is an act of faith. You're out on a topography that can kill you. You're out in a place where, humanity really can't live without some serious faith. The sea, the word sea, Galilee is not big enough to be a sea. Luke corrects that and calls it a lake. Luke is very detail-oriented. Matthew, perhaps reminding, about the sea. The word sea in that ancient connotation, not just for Jews and Jesus, but in the known world at that time, the sea was a metaphor for the unknown. Fear of the unknown. People would go out there and never come back. We don't know. They didn't have any sort of communication, right? So it's an act of faith, trusting in a power that's invisible and greater than themselves, the wind in your sails. So sailing is an act of faith. Now they go out on the sea. Verse 24. A storm suddenly arose, so great the boat was being swamped by the waves, but Jesus was asleep. Oh, beautiful story here, right? Again, does he not care? Is Jesus not human? Well, he was worn out from preaching that long sermon. And then as soon as he finished the sermon, he's trying to come down and get some food, but people are needy and they're all around. I can understand the Sunday afternoon nap. Sure. They went and woke him up and said, Lord, save us, we're perishing. Again, the repetition of calling Jesus Lord time and time again in Matthew, rather than somebody saying rabbi or teacher, that's important. Seeing the God in Jesus. Rescue the perishing. Favorite hymn of anybody? Slip up a hand. Here it is, inspired right here. We're perishing. So the disciples are fearful, anxious, and worried. This is a great story for anybody who's human today. Any humans here? Yeah, fearful, anxious, and you can relate to this. But what does he say? Why are you afraid, you of little faith? Now, is he scolding them? I kind of see Jesus say things like this sometimes with a smile. A little bit like you would chide a friend or a young person. Come on, you can do this. What do you have so little faith for? God's got this. Jesus stands up. So this is powerful just to think about this. He stands up and rebukes the winds and the sea. And there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, what sort of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? Well, peace in the storms of life is what this story is about for us, right? Many a sermon, so I won't try to preach a sermon. Let me check my watch again. So, Jesus' sleep in the midst of a storm is an example for us that we can have peace, we can have rest in God no matter our circumstances. Jesus exemplifies total confidence or trust or faith in God. And he stands up and rebukes the wind and the waves. They listen. So it's also a testimony to the power of God. Jesus is the creator God, power over creation. Only the creator could be powerful over the creation. And for me, I just turn it into a little prayer. Lord, if the wind and waves obey you, how much more should I? Right? So this is not even a thinking, rational, spirit alive kind of being. It's just the wind and the waves. And yet they are obedient. So with me, a human being given so much, we've been equipped with such gifts of a heart, a spirit, a mind, all of these things. We should be obedient if the wind and the waves. All right, so he comes to the other side. Here's another beautiful turn of phrase, just the other side, not just of the lake, but think about coming to the other side of the storms of your life. Isn't there something that God has for you, so much more in store on the other side of your difficult circumstance? When God brings you through to the other side, see what God can do. To the region of the Gadarenes. You see this translated in different ways, Gerasenes, Gadarenes. Matthew locates it in a small town, Gadara. So sometimes it's spelled a couple different ways. Don't worry about that. 2 men possessed. Now, if you remember this story of the Gerasene demoniac told in the other Gospels, it's one man. Mark tells it first. Matthew is doing something different. He's recalling there were 2. What you can get out of that is simply that Matthew maybe remembered it differently, the story itself, or that Matthew loves doubling things. So again, in a time where nobody had a word processor, typewriter, computer, where you could put all caps or underline, Matthew doubles things to underline something, to highlight it. 2 men possessed by demons came out of the tomb. So fierce, no one could pass. Suddenly they shouted, "What do you have to do with us, Son of God? Have you come to torment us?" Now a large herd of swine was feeding some distance, and the demons begged him, "If you cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." So Jesus said to them, "Go." They came out of the men, entered the swine. Suddenly the whole herd stampeded down and off a cliff and into the sea. They were drowned. So verse 33, swineherds ran off, going to town, told the whole story. The whole town came out to meet Jesus and believed in him. No. What did they do? The whole town, verse 34, begged him to leave. Isn't that interesting? So Jesus speaks peace to the elements, the storm, the wind, the waves, and there's peace. Jesus also speaks peace to the disturbed people who are suffering from mental disease or great difficulty, in this case demon possession, and there is peace, but with some price, right? So the pigs suffered. So anybody who's concerned about cruelty to animals, blame the devil in this story, please. But Matthew is making another point. This is the power in the presence of the person of Jesus, that not even the devil can withstand the power of Jesus, right? But it's interesting that in both the demons and the people of the town, you find the same idea. They all want Jesus to leave them alone. Isn't that interesting? So it's a story of God's power in Christ, but it's also a story of rejection, that Jesus is rejected here. Professor Garland, that I'm using as obviously a source for my understanding here, I've mentioned him a couple times, he says, Jesus more easily deals with demons than unwilling humans. Yeah, the demons seem to respond quicker, and the unwilling humans just, please, leave us alone, Very interesting. So let me sum up this chapter, and I'll get to some more questions. I want to come back, make sure, Eleanor, if we completely answered that. As always, you know this, I want to scratch where you itch, not literally. Just talking about your curiosity. All right, so let me zoom the lens out about chapter 8 and what's happening after the Sermon on the Mount, the actions of Jesus, these miracle stories. Why does Jesus do miracles? Well, he's the Son of God. This was God's will. But listen, there are only about 36 healings in the Bible. I mean, it says that he healed everybody in a certain town. There's certainly many, many more that could be recorded. But it's interesting because everybody that Jesus healed ultimately died. Even Lazarus that he brought back from the dead had the distinction of, or misfortune of, having to die twice. So Jesus, it's not only about somebody's physical need, right? And Jesus doesn't absolutely heal every single person. There's only about 36. So why do the miracles? What's the point? A couple of answers could be had for that. First of all, it's a demonstration of the heart of God, Jesus' own compassion. Second, it's his credibility or credentials. We've been talking about Matthew building credentials. He's seen as Lord. I mean, literally the living God on earth, right? So it's compassion, credentials, connecting with people, and a contrast with the conventional wisdom or the religious establishment. Let me unpack that a little bit if it helps. So, yes, you can understand the compassion. Yes, we can see in the gospel that it's Jesus as Son of God, that credential, believe him because he can do these things. Jesus certainly connects people with God through these miracles. Like the leper who was healed. I mean, he's reconnected in his religious community, but he's also personally experienced in his person, on his body, this power and presence of God in Jesus. So he's, no doubt, I would think, his faith is increased. Or the Roman centurion who came to ask for his slave to be healed. His faith is increased, lifted up by Jesus. Your faith has made you well. So he's connecting people with God. But I think the miracles also are part of the reasons why people started to want to kill Jesus. It's a contrast with the religious establishment. How dare, just like from the beginning, Jesus' baptism, John being out in the wilderness, how dare you say God is so available to anyone who would come to a river? You know, the religious establishment would say, we've got rules about that. There's this narrow way, and that's the only way it can be done. It's always been done this way. So don't go out there and just say anybody. You know, healing a centurion slave? How dare Jesus stoop so low and, eat with sinners and, yeah. Anyway, so it's this sort of contrast with the religious establishment. They're the ones, the priests, Pharisees, who have the power to talk about God, to demonstrate God, to show that God's power and forgiveness is only found in God, not in a person. So the miracles really accentuate, it's really a powerful thing. Basically, for you and I, we're to take it this way. Do you believe that Jesus is who he said he is, the Son of God, God's power in Jesus? So let's remember the context, and I'm going to show you, if you look at the back of your handout, you're probably right there, 4 different categories, or these were the sort of political parties of the day, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and the Pharisees. I want to put this in context as we wrap up, got a few minutes on this, to help you understand Jesus in Matthew's gospel particularly. Matthew's church could be thought of as a breakaway, kind of splintering off of the Jewish religion, synagogue down the street. That synagogue down the street, that's started by Messianic Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah, but all the regular, conventional, ordinary people, Jews of the day, they'd stay at the real synagogue, they would say. Matthew's teaching, it's a house church, if you would imagine, that synagogue down the street. And what was distinct about it? So one reason we think about it this way is Matthew's gospel, likely written in the 80s, not the 1980s, the original 80s. Okay, going back. This was after the destruction by Rome of that temple in Jerusalem. That is a big difference, right? And there were these writings, these disclaimers written by rabbis or synagogue leaders, Pharisees, at that time, talking about casting out, differentiating themselves from these Messianic Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah. They were not yet called Christians. So it was seen as like a breakaway, the bad people of the Jews, but they were still considered Jews down at that synagogue down the street that Matthew's running. Now, here's these various leadership groups, religious authorities or political parties, if you want to think of them that, and what their focus is. So if you're one of those who takes notes, I left you a little blank there. This is one of those, gimmicks that a teacher uses to try to capture your attention and help you participate interactively in learning. Right, so the Sadducees were the Jewish aristocracy. They were like tied in with the muckety-muck, the rubbing shoulders with the wealthiest of the Jewish leaders in their community. And what was their central focus? For the Sadducees, it was the temple. So you can understand that by the 80s, the temple had been gone, 10, 15 years. These people's influence was dying out. The Zealots. Next are the Zealots. They were the patriots. Israel nationalism. Israelites as a nation. Kingship and kingdom. This was all about the physical, earthly nation of Israel like David had done it when it was back in the day, our glory days, when Israel was a superpower in the region. They want a Messiah like a victorious soldier, warrior king like David. So their focus was the nation of Israel. The Essenes, I don't know if you've studied these at all, but when you heard about like the Dead Sea Scrolls and communities out there in the wilderness living in caves, these were religious people who retreated from daily life like a monastic vow of separation. So they go into the wilderness, and the land itself, the Holy Land, was their focus. That's what was most important. But finally, and this is where our focus is, this is where our attention is drawn so much in the Gospels, because the Pharisees show up all the time. You don't often hear the other groups named because it's kind of beyond their time of best influence. Like the Sadducees, their time of best influence was when the temple was in full swing, right? But its temple is gone now. So it becomes the Pharisees are the teachers of the law, where the Torah, the word itself, which is a movable focus of worship, right? You don't need a temple. You can teach it in a local community, in a house of, Bethel, like a house of not just worship, but teaching. Teaching house, a synagogue is what that is. And so the Pharisees, the Torah is their key focus. So they come in conflict with Jesus the most because Jesus, particularly in Matthew, is the great teacher, the new Moses. So this is why the Pharisees are so vocal in their rejection of Jesus, their criticism of Jesus, and their readiness to do anything to get him off the stage. They want him out of the way so that they continue to have their power in their synagogues. So that's hopefully a little bit of context that helps you put this, chapter 8 and this whole gospel into a better understanding. I'll take some questions, hopefully try to clarify some things, and like I did in this session, if after I go off camera, there's some things that are really helpful, I'll bring it back at the beginning of next session. Again, sorry for my fumble. Anybody watching at home, next time wear a helmet.